Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of 10 Minutes to a Better Building, a podcast brought to you by the building experts at Boland. I'm your host, Tyler Kern. Thanks so much for joining us for another episode of the show. Joining me once again here, back for his second appearance on the podcast, is Kevin Bradley, sales team leader at Boland. Kevin, welcome to another episode of the show. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks again for having me, Tyler. Appreciate it.
Of course. Happy to have you on today, Kevin. Today, we are diving into an update on refrigerants. And so we're going to update some info. There's some changing regulations. And so we need to dive into all of those things here today. So, Kevin, give us a broad update on some of the changing regulations around refrigerant and some of the things that are happening.
In the previous administration, politics aside, there was direction to start reducing some of the refrigerants that have a global warming potential greater than 1. So, and then the Trump administration slowed down some things. Biden administration's in charge now. And so they're pushing forward a lot of the regulations to get rid of refrigerants that have a very high global warming potential, because we're trying to reduce what's going on out there. So there's things, for example, January 1st, 2024, we can no longer sell chillers with R134A. R134A is just about in every chiller, air-cooled chiller, water-cooled chiller we sell. So this is a big change for us. And then January 1st, 2025, refrigerants such as R410A will be also eliminated from any new equipment. So we have to come up with alternatives. And some of these alternatives have some different characteristics that we have to plan for.
That's a really interesting just kind of way that sometimes what's going on in the political realm ends up making its way down to what's happening now in the world of HVAC. So what are some of the forces, like you mentioned, driving this change? Obviously administration, but then, rejoining different climate accords and things like that. Is that kind of pushing some of these regulations forward?
Yes. So when the Biden administration joined the Kigali Agreement, I may have killed that name, but it was a worldwide agreement on what to do with refrigerants in order to reduce our global warming potential. And so part of that was we got to get some of the low-hanging fruit, which is usually the refrigerants in our case, to reduce our global warming and move forward with newer technology. Now, this, again, major impact for us, trying to, figure out what refrigerants we have available to us, what new ones are out there, and then all the testing and things that go along with them. Thank goodness Trane was already ahead of the curve in regards to a lot of these. The R134 alternative was already out there. We've had it actually available for about 3 or 4 years in anticipation of what was coming. So we already have that one available. But a lot of it has to do, again, with trying to reduce our global warming. That is a big thing going on in there. Decarbonization is another word that we see. There was a recent law that got passed through Congress for a lot of funding for electric cars. That's a big thing as well, too, reducing how much reliance we have upon gasoline and using more electricity. And it means more sustainable, like solar power, and refrigerants is another big thing. So, for example, CO2 has a global warming potential of 1. Everything is based off of that. R134A has a global warming potential of somewhere around 13 to 1400, which means it is 1300 to 1400 times worse when it gets released into the air than CO2 is. So it's a big deal to get rid of that refrigerant. Some of the newer alternatives have closer to 400 to 500. They're still bad, but they're less bad than the R134A is.
Yeah, that's really interesting and kind of brings into perspective what some of these regulations are trying to do and that sort of thing. So how do you think the industry will react to the impact of these changes, right? And what challenges do you think are posed from these changing regulations? As things change and evolve, obviously the industry is going to react. So how do you see that happening?
Refrigerants are kind of based off what pressure they are. So medium pressure, which is where 134A is, all of the manufacturers that are part of what we call AHRI, which is kind of the group that everybody kind of formed, that all the manufacturers got together and said, we're going to create standards and things so that everybody's playing from a level playing field. 100% signing of a letter that went to Congress and went to everybody and went to the EPA saying we're on board with getting rid of 134A by a certain date. So medium pressure already been kind of taken care of. All the manufacturers are on board. high pressure refrigerants, which are R410A is the larger one, and R410A is in all your household equipment, your household air conditioning units, VRF, which is a big technology that we work with, packaged rooftop units, which you see on top of a building. So R410A is a very, very large refrigerant. The question now is which refrigerant will be its replacement? And either way you go, both refrigerant, the two leading that are out there, both have a new characteristic of being flammable, which the current refrigerants we have today, none of them are flammable. Now, you can use propane as a refrigerant, but it's not a highly used refrigerant in there. But if we're going to use a lot of refrigerant like R410A and replace it with something that is flammable, there's a lot more questions that come into effect. A lot more code impacts. How do we pipe it? Installation methods. There's a lot of different things that'll come into play, and the clear winner has not shown itself. The one thing, the U.S. is definitely behind. Other places like Europe and Asia are already using some of these alternative refrigerants. So they've already been installing, operating some of these newer alternatives out there. And two of the leaders are R32 and R454B. They are the current two that are leading the pack, I'll call it. Both of them are flammable, and both of them are being used in both Europe and Asia. So we're not going to be the first ones out there that have ever dealt with this stuff, which is good in one sense. So there is some things coming up there, but they definitely have some impact. And a lot of things have to do with a lot of the resources that Trane and others are putting into. They have to build, test, and come up with new equipment that meets all the current standards as well as what the potential future standards are going to be. So there's a lot of changes going to be happening in regards to, I'll call it the high pressure refrigerant equipment in the next 2 years.
Yeah, lots of changes and a lot of things that are going to evolve and move over these next couple of years. And so, one of the things that we've mentioned kind of throughout this podcast, Kevin, is just how, impact of global warming is measured, right? And some of the numbers that you brought up earlier. We know that a lot of companies have sustainability goals. So how can changing refrigerants help reduce your carbon footprint and help you meet some of those sustainability goals? Because at the end of the day, that's something that a lot of people are striving for and looking to attain, right?
Correct. Yeah. And so if you've got older pieces of equipment that you may have in your buildings, even from the early 1990s, the equipment may be running fine. But for example, we're changing out some chillers at a building that have R11. R11 has a global warming potential of over 2,000. And just changing to a chiller with R514A, which is one of the alternatives in the low pressure equipment, which have a global warming potential of less than, I think, 2, it's going to leak eventually. And again, we don't want that stuff getting into the atmosphere and hurting the environment. So it's a big change there. But honestly, looking at your equipment today, how old it is, how much it's leaking, and again, looking up some of the possible alternatives out there with some of the newer refrigerants. And this is where Boland can help you. So don't think you have to, sit down and figure this all out on your own. Call us here at Boland. All of our people are pretty well trained and understand what to look at and what the impact would be. Buying anything today with some of the older refrigerants, it's not a bad thing. You just need to be understanding of what's going to happen, how long the equipment's going to last, how well is it going to be serviced, and just understand and being able to prep yourself for changes as they come along.
For sure. Yeah, that's a great point. That kind of took me where I wanted to wrap up the podcast today. And I was just discussing the fact that this is not the first time that regulations have changed. And so Boland has obviously seen this before and has navigated this before, which gives you confidence anyways that you can help navigate these circumstances and these changing regulations as well.
Yeah, no, obviously we've been through a couple of transitions. The first one came around the early 1990s. Now it was just a wee little thing back then, but that was when R11 was told we had to get rid of R11 and we had to change to another type of low pressure refrigerant or another type of thing there. 2010, we had to stop manufacturing equipment with R22 in it. 2020, we had to stop manufacturing equipment with R123 in it. So nothing here is different or old, or brand new to us. We've been through these before. We've been through equipment transitions like this before. And again, it's the world's not on fire. We can easily get through this, and we here at Boland are here to help you walk through this.
Good stuff. Kevin Bradley, thank you once again for joining us here on the podcast today and sharing a little bit more about changing regulations and what's going on in the world of refrigerant.
Thanks, Tyler.
Absolutely. And everyone, thank you for tuning into another episode of 10 Minutes to a Better Building. As always, Boland.com is the place to go if you want to reach out, if you want to talk to someone like Kevin about these changing regulations and you have questions and you need some more answers, make sure to reach out to Boland to get the answers that you need. And thank you once again for tuning into another episode of the podcast. We appreciate it very much. Of course, we'll be back soon with new episodes of the podcast. But for this one, for my guest today, Kevin Bradley, I've been your host, Tyler Kern. Thanks for joining us.